The Seahawks start a season 4-0 for the first time since 2013. The Storm bring home their fourth WNBA championship, and we have another on this date in Seattle sports. Let's take it around the sound. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Around the Sound. It's so good to be back in the studio. It's so good to be with you guys here today. We had an explosion of news over the weekend, and to begin this week, none probably bigger than the WNBA Finals, the Storm sweeping the Las Vegas Aces. We will get to that later in the episode, but welcome back to Around the Sound if you've listened to us before. And of course, welcome if you are new. This is episode 8. Make sure you follow me on Twitter at @ThePeytonThomas, and don't miss a beat of the podcast. Follow us on Instagram here at Around the Sound Seattle. If you would like to watch the podcast, we're available on YouTube. Search up PTOM Media, that's PTHOM Media, or you can listen to us wherever you get your podcast. If you're an Apple Podcast listener, please rate the show 5 stars. That definitely helps me out, having a good rating on there. And if you like the show in general, just please tell your friends, tell some other people about it. I'm trying to grow my brand and grow the show. Growing helps everybody around here. More guests, more better segments with you guys, and more interaction in the Q&A and all that good stuff that comes with it. So let's hop right into the Week 4 performance, the Seahawks versus the Dolphins. The Seahawks extended their winning streak to 4 games to start the year. First time they are 4-0 since 2013. That was the year of Super Bowl 48, where the Seahawks beat the Broncos 43-8. in the Super Bowl, and this is the first time since then that they've actually started a season 4-0. So is this an off week for the Seahawks? I think that's the big question that coming out of this game I was asking myself after watching this offense still win comfortably but not play at the same level that we had seen them come out and blitz teams in the first 3 weeks. I thought that despite the win still being comfortable, I mean, the Seahawks were up 16 points with less than 3 minutes, I think, in the game to go. The Dolphins did score a late touchdown to try to make it interesting, but it never really was within reach. So I'm wondering, is this sort of the worst version of the Seahawks we're going to see? Because the Dolphins aren't particularly a fantastic team, and I feel like if the offense was absolutely on their best, it could have been another 40, 45, 50-point game like we've seen in weeks 1 through 3 between Russ and the offense. I'm not sure if it was just a bad game for Russ, and it really wasn't that bad of a game, and that's kind of what we're going to talk about. I'm not sure if it was the offensive line, the receivers, but let's break down the position groups. So this is the first time that Russ has actually looked human in a game. I thought that he was under pressure, he was under duress several times in that game, but there were a few throws that he made. Some of them, there was 1 or 2 that Tyler Lockett couldn't really get to. I think there was 1 for DK, but it was the first time this season where I felt that Russell Wilson's throws might not have been his best. He looked human. He was making some mistakes that ordinary other quarterbacks in the NFL are prone to making all the time, and that includes the red zone interception to Xavier Howard. It was the first real interception of the year that Russell Wilson had thrown. Obviously, he has 2 blips on his resume now with those 2 interceptions, the first one being against the Patriots on that pass to Greg Olsen on the opening drive. Greg Olsen tries to make the grab, tipped off his hands right to one of the McCourty twins. I don't recall which one, for the pick 6, but that wasn't really a real pick. That one's not on Russell Wilson. A majority of the time, Greg Olsen's going to haul that one in, and it's just going to be yet another completion. This was the first real throw where, yeah, the DB made a great play on the ball. Receiver could have done maybe a little bit better to be in a better position. I'm not sure if it was DK or if it was David Moore, but that was the first real interception that Russell Wilson had thrown all year. It was the first time that it wasn't a tip pick like the Greg Olsen interception was. The 2 biggest highlights of that game were, however, the 2 touchdowns to David Moore. The first one before halftime, it was some busted coverage. I think it was the rookie, the first rounder for the Miami Dolphins who plays corner. I forget his name. He's got a long last name. But David Moore was able to bust through the coverage. Russell scrambled out to his left, I believe, and fired a good ball to David Moore. And then the second touchdown, Moore was able to get his feet down somehow in the corner of the end zone in a great ball and a great catch on that one. Certainly the biggest highlights for Russell Wilson's quote off game. I keep saying off game and I'm being really hard, but in reality, it was still a pretty good game by the Seahawks offense. They still put up over 30 points. Russ finished the day 24 for 34, 360 passing yards, 2 touchdowns, and then that 1 interception. So 360 yards passing, and we're going to call it an off day. That's setting the standard extremely, extremely high for this offense. I think the reason that a lot of Seahawks fans are being critical of the offense's performance this week is just because of how good people have watched the Seahawks offense specifically been against pretty decent defenses. People were skeptical about the Falcons secondary coming in, and Russell Wilson was able to torch the Falcons secondary in week 1, but it was really in week 2 against the Patriots that people learned that the Seahawks offense wasn't just capable of doing this against poor secondaries. Week 3, the Cowboys don't have a great secondary. The Cowboys gave up 51 points to the Browns. That was a crazy game from this Sunday. Dak Prescott has put up a record amount of passing yards throughout the first 4 weeks and is sitting at 1-3 in the NFC East. The NFC East is crazy, by the way. This is a little bit of a tangent, but as of right now, or as of before the Sunday night game between the 49ers and the Eagles, the leading team in the NFC East was the 1-3 Washington football team, name redacted. Then it was the New York Giants are 0-4. The Philadelphia Eagles before the 49ers game were 0-2-1. Now that they have beat the 49ers, they are sitting atop the NFC East at 1-2-1, which is incredible that you have to think that one of those teams is going to make the playoffs. All 4 teams in the NFC West. We'll get whip around coverage of what happened around the NFC West this week, but all 4 teams in the NFC West, the Niners, the Rams, the Cardinals, and the Seahawks, all deserve a playoff spot over any of those NFC East teams. So anyway, David Moore, we talk about those 2 grabs. I think Lockett, he did drop 1 or 2 passes during that game. We're going to the wide receivers now. DK had a quiet but productive game. I think he had almost maybe just a little bit over 100 receiving yards, but no real explosive plays from DK, no touchdowns from DK that game. But I just, back to reiterate the point, it was just a little bit underwhelming from the offense, but Philip Dorsett and Flash Gordon aren't even back yet, and both of those guys could be on the roster by the end of the year. So if this was the worst version of the Seahawks offense that we're going to see, and you still have Philip Dorsett and Flash Gordon that haven't even seen the field yet this year, this receiving core is going to be pretty good. If this was the off day, if Lockett dropping 1 or 2 balls, DK not having a fantastic game as a red zone threat, he caught a lot of passes out in the middle of the drive, but I think that DK's real value comes in the long bomb touchdowns or being a red zone threat at that massive 6'4", 250 whatever frame. If this is the worst version of it, if this is the off game, this is going to be a really, really good receiving core, assuming that everybody stays healthy. If the Seahawks are able to add Philip Dorsett and Flash Gordon by the end of the year, you add those 2 guys to the trio of Lockett, DK, and Moore, you have a pretty solid group of guys. Even if one of those guys goes down, you still have 4 really solid options behind them. And Freddie Swain made another good grab in this game. He could be yet another option. The Seahawks are extremely deep right now at wide receiver. Let's talk a little bit about the pass coverage, something that I thought was lacking just a little bit this game. We saw a quick return for injury for all 3 interior linemen. I know in episode 7 of Around the Sound last weekend before the game, I wasn't sure whether Damian Lewis was going to be back at guard, Posick was going to be back at center, or Iupati was going to be back at that opposite guard position. All 3 of those interior linemen were back for this game. They played. And a side note, there were no injuries in this game for the Seahawks. They sustained no injuries throughout the whole game, which Pete Carroll mentioned in the post-game press conference that the Seahawks sustained no injuries during that game. Definitely great news, especially when you see this year a lot of the other teams around the league taking at least 1 or 2 significant season-ending injuries every game. The Falcons in the Monday night game against the Packers basically didn't have a secondary by the time it was over. They have more secondary injury problems than the Seahawks have, which is kind of hard to believe with the number of guys that we are putting back, or the Seahawks are putting back into the secondary, like Ryan Neal, who was just recently called up from the practice squad. But the pass coverage, Russ was running for his life a bit this game. I'm not sure if it was specifically on just those interior linemen, if they weren't fully back to being healthy, but Russ did have to run a little bit for his life. I want to give credit to Emmanuel Ogbah and Shaq Lawson. Both DNs for the Dolphins were in Russell Wilson's face very, very often, all day long, and certainly seemed to have an impact on how Russ was able to get the ball downfield. On some of those throws where Russ looked human, I definitely see the collapsing pocket, as a factor in why some of those throws were a little bit off the mark, why Russell wasn't quite perfect on a lot of those throws. If Russ has a clean pocket, I think a lot of those miscues on passes, they go away. If Russ has the time, he's normally a quarterback that's going to put the ball in the right spot every time, regardless of the distance. The run blocking, however, continues to be solid without any major problems. Chris Carson had a productive game. He was back from injury as well. We saw DJ Dallas. Let's move on to the running backs now. He had a little bit of a breakout performance, got a few carries and a few receptions. Carlos Hyde was inactive for the game, which sort of allowed DJ Dallas to pick up those snaps, pick up those carries, those receptions. And the few times that he touched the ball 4, maybe 5 times, he looked pretty explosive. He gained at least 1 or 2 first downs and was promising as a guy that's going to be a solid backup piece if Carlos Hyde ever goes down or if Chris Carson goes down for an extended period of time. Travis Homer also got a touchdown in this game, but a fun nugget about DJ Dallas, he went to the U. He was a Miami, he was drafted by the Seahawks in the 6th round out of Miami, and so he got to play back in his home college stadium in Miami, since the Dolphins and the University of Miami both play in Hard Rock Stadium as it is now. They change the name of that every year or two, it seems. Defensively, another tough game overall. I will say there were certainly some bright spots. The Seahawks really made Fitzmagic look a little bit more dynamic than I think he really was. I thought the defensive line did a better job of forcing pressure onto Fitzpatrick. It forced at least one of the interceptions, if not both, but it was a little bit inconsistent. I think there were some times where the D-line really broke through and put pressure on Fitzpatrick to make a tough throw, and we saw that in at least one of the interceptions. But I want to also mention the Seahawks didn't really blitz much in that game. They were able to drop 7 guys into pressure. I think it was over 80% of the time, and a big reason for that is Jamal Adams, one of the guys that you are going to most likely send on those blitzes, Jamal Adams and Bruce Irvin. So the most likely linebacker to blitz and the most likely member out of the secondary to blitz, both of those guys are out, which means the Seahawks are probably more comfortable sitting back with those guys like Cody Barton, like Ryan Neal in the secondary and in the linebacking core than they are with those guys rushing, trying to get to Ryan Fitzpatrick. So the D-line was forced to try and create pressure with only blitzing, or not blitzing at all, only rushing 4 and dropping 7 guys into coverage. I thought they were okay. It was a little inconsistent. There were some great plays made by the defensive line as far as pressuring goes, and there were also some times where I thought Fitzpatrick had plenty of time in the pocket, and if it was collapsing, he always seemed to have a way out. Ryan Fitzpatrick, regardless of how old he is, he continues to be able to escape the pocket and run for first downs amazingly. I'm not sure how he's not doing it without a wheelchair at this point. He's been doing it for so long. So Cody Barton played in place of Jordan Brooks, who was injured, also playing in place of Bruce Irvin. So Cody Barton is the 3rd string linebacker in that outside linebacker position, and he played a really great game. He got the tip on the first drive, which was basically tipped right into Ryan Neal's hands for the first interception. Both of those guys not slated to be starters at the start of the year. Cody Barton was a backup linebacker. Ryan Neal was sitting on the practice squad. Those guys combining to create the first interception of that game for the Seahawks. KJ Wright, in the other outside linebacker position, was absolutely everywhere. I thought he looked like Bobby Wagner when Bobby Wagner was on his game. KJ Wright was making tackles on what seemed like every player, every other play. He was blowing people up. He was flying all over the place, locking people down. A great game from Bobby Wagner overall, and he was so close to at least 1 interception that would have been absolutely huge, if not 2. I think he definitely got his hands on 1. I'm not sure about that other one. Let's talk about the secondary, which is still really banged up, like I mentioned, but they still were able to make a lot of important plays that game. There was no real busted coverage. I think the longest play from scrimmage the Miami Dolphins were able to have on offense was something like 26 yards, and even that was a little more than what was the standard. Last week against the Cowboys, the Seahawks did bust coverage once or twice. Trey Flowers, I think, was beat. There were some other players that were beat on deep routes. I thought the cloud coverage overall from the secondary was pretty good. They kept almost everything in front of them. I want to mention the inactives just in the secondary for the Seahawks were Jamal Adams, Hill, Thorpe, and Dunbar. All 4 of those guys were inactive and out for this game. What a pickup Ryan Neal is looking like. He was forced to start this game with both Lano Hill and Jamal Adams out. he's the next guy to step up. He was the one who was the hero last week in week 3 against the Cowboys that got the game-sealing interception. He picks up another interception in week 4 after the tip from Cody Barton, and this was a guy that was on the practice squad at the beginning of the year, activated for week 3, starts in week 4, and he's looking like a really productive part of that secondary while all of those guys are out, while the Seahawks secondary is so banged up. Let's talk about what happened around the NFC West now. The 49ers picked up a Sunday Night Football loss to the Eagles in the tight game. We mentioned the Eagles on that tangent about the NFC East being incredibly, incredibly terrible. I was actually surprised the 49ers did drop this game. They did have Kittle back, and Kittle had a huge game, but Kittle was the only real weapon they had on offense. And while the Eagles are a mediocre team, Carson Wentz is still capable of being a good quarterback on his day. I think Carson Wentz had a somewhat bounce-back day. I don't think Carson Wentz is anywhere close to what he was in the season that the Eagles were able to start 12-2 with him before he got injured, and Nick Foles ultimately won the Super Bowl for the Eagles. But the 49ers dropped to 2-2. The Rams picked up another win and improved to 3-1. The Rams sort of snuck by a terrible New York Giants team. The Daniel Jones for the New York Giants had a chance to go down the field and tie the game. Doing the 2-minute drill, they were down 8, ultimately threw a pick, so congratulations to the Rams for beating a truly terrible football team. The Cardinals dropped another game as Kyler returned to his normal form. Kyler Murray was trying to keep pace for Russell Wilson through the first 2 weeks, and the Cardinals were looking like a very good team. But the Cardinals have significant problems on the O-line. The defense is still young, and they dropped another game to the Panthers, who aren't really particularly great either. I think that the Panthers are probably the worst team in the NFC South right now, but neither are the Cards. After seeing these last 2 games, I think a lot of people realized that the first 2 games that we saw from the Cardinals weren't particularly real. After losing to the Lions and losing to the Panthers, 2 teams which are not near the top of the NFL as it comes to when it all comes down to it. Those 2 teams are not teams that we are going to see in the playoffs this year. The Panthers very well could finish bottom of the NFC South, and the Lions very well could finish bottom of the NFC North, although the Vikings are not making it easy for them to finish last. But the Cardinals dropped 2 straight bad games, and so the Seahawks continued to gain ground on everybody else in the NFC West. The Rams sitting at 3-1 behind them, and to reiterate, the 49ers and the Cardinals both sitting at 2-2. Other big storylines across the NFL, the Houston Texans, who really, going into this year, I thought were probably the 3rd best team in the AFC, sitting behind Patrick Mahomes and the Chiefs and Lamar Jackson and the Ravens. But the Ravens have had their own struggles a little bit, but the Texans start 0-4 and fire Bill O'Brien, fire their coach this early into a season, which seems crazy to be forced to leave your team with an interim head coach for the remainder of the season with a team that in reality could probably make a run. The AFC South that they're in, the Colts look better but are still not great. Those are winnable games for the Texans. The Titans are okay. The Jags really aren't great. So the Texans start 0-4, but this is jumping ship on a coach in a little bit too quickly, in my opinion. You have to remember, take into account what kind of teams the Texans have played. They started the year against the Chiefs, then they had to play the Ravens, and then they had to play the Steelers. Right now, those are probably the 3 best teams in the AFC that they were forced to play. Week 4, they played an 0-3 Vikings team, and I'm not going to make any excuses for why they lost that game. The Texans played a horrible game in Week 4 against the Vikings, and the Vikings are not particularly a great football team. But to fire your head coach after playing 3 of the toughest teams in the conference seems a little harsh. I'm surprised that if they were willing to jump ship on Bill O'Brien so quickly, that they wouldn't have just sacked him or gotten rid of him at the end of last year or in the offseason to allow a new system to come in. You have Deshaun Watson at the helm, who's a great quarterback. You have some great players on the other side of the ball, like J.J. Watt, that can make plays defensively. The Texans are a playoff team, and they've really screwed it up this year. You either had to stick with Bill O'Brien for at least a few more weeks and see if he could try to turn it around. Remember, the Texans are the same team that started 0-3, was it last year or the year before, and then rattled off 9 straight victories. He was capable of turning this ship around, in my opinion. Was it going to be 9 straight again? Most likely not, but in a division that's not super hot, the Colts are looking pretty good, but in a division that isn't super, super hot, Now that there's 7 seeds in the playoffs for both conferences, I think it was a salvageable hole that the Texans had put themselves in. Firing Bill O'Brien is a symptom of a franchise that was really ready to move on, so I'm not sure what kind of route they are expecting to take for the rest of the season, but we'll have to watch that one. Aaron Rodgers and the Packers. Aaron Rodgers is the only guy trying to keep pace with Russell Wilson in the MVP conversation so far through 4 weeks. The Packers look great and start 4-0. The Packers were 13-3 last year, but had a relatively easy schedule and looked like a really shaky team during parts of that year. They did beat the Seahawks in the divisional round, but then got slapped up by the 49ers last year in the NFC Championship game. After the Packers drafted Love in the first round, who ultimately probably will end up being Aaron Rodgers' successor, Aaron Rodgers has absolutely turned it on ever since the Packers drafted Love. Aaron Rodgers said, nope, no way, this is still my job for a couple more years, and has been going on an absolute tear. Packers start 4-0 and are leading the NFC North. All right, let's shift into the WNBA now. The Storm win championship number 4. Breanna Stewart wins Finals MVP after suffering an Achilles injury as the Storm easily sweep aside the Las Vegas Aces in 3 games. The WNBA Finals is a 5-game series. The Storm looked comfortable in all 3 of those victories at points in those games, blew out the Las Vegas Aces in Game 3. Sue Bird, who is ageless, it seems. Ageless. This is year 17 for Sue Bird. Sliced apart the defense throughout the entire series with ease. So congrats to everybody surrounding the Storm organization for bringing home championship number 4 to the Pacific Northwest. All right, let's talk about the Mariners heading into 2021. Jerry Dipoto talked to the media this week, and he stated that his official goal for the Mariners next year is to ultimately reach the playoffs. They finished 27-33 in this year's shortened 60-game season format. They had a chance, although it was slight, in the last week to ultimately make a playoff berth. The cards did not fall perfectly for them, but ultimately finishing 27-33 in this year was somewhat of a surprise. I don't think many people thought the Mariners would be anywhere near 500 this year, especially looking at a lot of the young prospects they're going to bring up. But you had big performances over the course of the year by guys like Kyle Lewis. I think we had a resurgence of Kyle Seager. We saw plenty of encouraging things from the guys that we brought up in the starting rotation, like Sheffield and like Justin Dunn. But let's take a look and let's kind of dive deep in. If Jerry Dipoto thinks that the Mariners can make the playoffs in 2021, what really needs to change? What kind of players need to take a step up for that goal to be realistic? And first off, Kyle Lewis. Kyle Lewis was so fantastic for the first month and a half of that shortened 60-game season, but what people don't really want to talk about is the fact that during the last month of that season, he still should win AL Rookie of the Year over Luis Robert of the White Sox. But during the last month of that season, the shortened game season, the last 20 or so games, he batted under 200 and really fell into a cold spell. So next year, Kyle Lewis playing a full 162-game season in the major leagues, he needs to find some consistency. He needs to find a way to keep adapting his game to stay ahead of Major League Baseball pitching. There's plenty of guys, Daniel Vogelbach being a prime example. He's going to come up to the major leagues. He's going to bat really well for a couple of months. But once major league pitchers figure out how that batter likes to approach at bats, in Daniel Vogelbach's case, he would sit and wait for 3, 4, 5 pitches of an at bat before swinging at all. Once pitchers figure that out, they'll find a way to counter the way that that player approaches their at bats and ultimately make them sort of an obsolete hitter. I hope that's not what's happening to Kyle Lewis, because he had such a great start to the season. In that last month, a little bit of discouraging numbers, batting under 200, certainly finished the year on a slump. Next year, look for Kyle Lewis to try to gain some consistency throughout those numbers, not be quite as streaky, and over the 162-game season, try to keep a consistent batting average in the high 200 range. I don't think expecting Kyle Lewis to bat over 300 is a super realistic expectation right now. He's still a young player, despite just how well he played in the first month and a half of the shortened season. He's still young, he's still growing, and I would expect Kyle Lewis to, in this offseason, find a way to stay consistent and adapt against major league pitching. Next up is Evan White, who looked better in the second half of that season, but needs to continue trending upward. He batted a little bit under 200 for the whole year. I think after he came up in the first half of the season, he really struggled hitting the bat. He showed some sparks, some flashes of some plate discipline and some great at-bats against some good major league pitching, but we're going to need to see more of that. We're going to need to see Evan White take the next step, just like Kyle Lewis, and find more consistency up in that mid 250, 260 batting average range. I don't know if Evan White's quite going to get there in 2021. Eventually he might get there. He's an incredible player defensively at first base. Evan White makes great plays over there at first base all the time. It's the hitting for Evan White next year to take the next big step in becoming a key part of the Mariners roster. Next is the starting pitching. Justice Sheffield and Justin Dunn both took big steps this year and look like they can be reliable parts of this starting rotation for the Seattle Mariners next year. But the biggest question marks for 2021 for the Seattle Mariners going into it are two guys that we have not even seen in the big leagues yet. It's Kelenic and Gilbert, Logan Gilbert and Jared Kelenic, two guys that are trying to fill into what are needed positions for the Mariners, and it would be the thing that elevates this Seattle Mariners team to an ultimate playoff berth, is Kelenic and Gilbert, guys that we've heard so much about. It's guys that have potential higher than the sky, guys that the media has not stopped talking about and not stopped speculating on how great their major league careers can be ever since they were drafted. Both Kelenic and Gilbert are slated to come up, if not at the start of 2021, maybe a month or two into the 2021 season, and both of those guys are going to have to be called up and actually perform consistently to be taken seriously at the major league level. Being talked about, having potential is one thing, but you have to actually do it in the major leagues for it to count for anything. We know you guys have the potential. Everybody's heard about these two players for a long time throughout this Mariners rebuild. If 2021 is the year, those two kids coming up are going to have to be the stars and have call-ups similar to what we saw from Kyle Lewis or Justin Dunn that hit the ground running as soon as they were put into that Major League Baseball starting role. Last off, to make a playoff push, you need the bullpen. And Jerry Dipoto has hinted at this. A lot of people know that the Mariners bullpen really struggled in 2020, but the thing about bullpen is there's almost always reliable free agents, reliable, a lot of times older, expensive arms in free agency that you can use to beef up your bullpen, but most teams aren't willing to spend that sort of money for one or two, sometimes three bullpen arms, unless it's really going to improve your team and unless the rest of your team is really capable at making a run at not just a playoff berth, but possibly the World Series. If Jerry Dipoto thinks he has the pieces to make a 2021 playoff push, if he thinks that all of the guys that I listed above he's going to get a push from in 2021 are going to be important parts of the Seattle Mariners roster in 2021, I would expect Jerry Dipoto to add at least one or two expensive veteran bullpen arms to strengthen the bullpen as they try to make that push. I also would not be surprised to see guys like Ty France, Phillip Ervin, or possibly even Mitch Haniger, older guys that are going to start to be phased out of the roster. I would not be surprised to see Jerry Dipoto try to flip those guys for possibly one of those older veteran bullpen arms. All right, let's talk about On This Date in Seattle Sports. We have another edition of On This Date in Seattle Sports. October 8th. October 8th is what? Is that the Thursday? That is Thursday. October 8th is Thursday. It is the 25th anniversary of a very, very significant event in not just Seattle Mariners history, but in Seattle sports history. And it is probably the greatest moment in the history of Mariners baseball. And to quote Macklemore in his song My Oh My, it's 1995, the division series, Edgar's up to bat, bottom of the 11th inning. Let's just listen to it. We'll pull up the audio clip for all of you guys, and we can listen.
The stretch. And the 0-1 pitch on the way to Edgar Martinez. Swung on and line down the left field line for a base hit. Here comes Joy. Here's Junior to third base. They're going to wave him in. The throw to the plate will be late. The Mariners are going to play for the American League Championship. I don't believe it. It just continues. My, oh my. Edgar Martinez.
One of the greatest Dave Niehaus calls throughout his entire career, in one of the most important games that Dave Niehaus was ever able to call for the Seattle Mariners up until 1995. Since the Mariners' inception in 1977 had not found almost any success, that push, that playoff push in 1995 and that win in the division series is ultimately what kept the Seattle Mariners in Seattle past that 1995 season. There was a lot of speculation about the future of the Kingdome by that point, a lot of speculation about the future of Seattle sports, specifically the Mariners. That 1995 team saved Mariners baseball, one of the greatest calls ever to go along with it. I got the opportunity to watch that game in full, Game 3, Game 4, and Game 5 of that series. All three of the games the Mariners won in full during this quarantine. I think Root Sports was playing all of the games back in full, and I got to catch those last three. And it just reminded me what an amazing series utterly that was. I mean, to go down 0-2 in a brutal fashion, close games in New York, then to have to come back forced to win all three of those home games. It was an incredible series. Mariners came back from 0-2 down to win Game 5 with the double. Edgar Martinez lining it down the left field line. Griffey sliding into home plate, gets up. You have the iconic shot of Griffey's smile after he scored. All of the Mariners piling onto home plate as they moved in past the Yankees into the ALCS. All right, guys, I think that's all that I have for you today with episode 8. We'll come back with episode 9 on Saturday. We will preview week 5 for the Seahawks against the Vikings. We'll have plenty more news to talk about, and we'll have to see what happens before then. So if you have not already, make sure you follow the podcast on Instagram at Around the Sound Seattle. Follow me on Twitter at the Peyton Thomas. But until then, stay safe and thanks for listening.